On 18 Frimaire, year 2 of the revolutionary calendar, or 8 December 1793 on the Gregorian calendar, the Committee of Public Safety in Revolutionary Paris ordered the arrest of Charles Dulac, an officer in the Revolutionary Army, holding the rank of Secretary of the Representatives of the People. 4 days later, a squadron of 4 men arrived at Dulac's residence. They arrested him and led him off to the Luxembourg prison to await an appearance before the Revolutionary Tribunal. In addition, the revolutionary officials seized over 200 documents belonging to Charles and to his older brother Gregory, who also resided in their apartments during these years. These papers offer a joint biography of the brothers in 1792 and 1793 as the constitutional monarchy ended and the terror began. I will sketch the outlines of their military careers in a moment. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. Curiously, the arresting officers also seized 120 used playing cards that day. The cards, annotated by Gregory, contain quotes from sources such as the New Testament, classical authors, especially Seneca and Plutarch, the 16th century skeptic Montaigne, and 18th century sources, including Rousseau, the Republican political theorist Mably, and the Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert. One might, of course, dismiss the scribblings on the back of these playing cards as a random collection of epigrams. Rather than discarding these ephemeral bits of paper, however, the brothers clung to them during the tumultuous events in France of the early 1790s. I would like to argue that these playing cards represent a self-curated snapshot of the cultural heritage available to these 2 young men, a type of evidence that is more revealing of their intellectual predispositions than if the guards had found the collected works of Rousseau or Voltaire or the complete encyclopédie in their Parisian apartments. These playing cards add up to a portable, unbound, commonplace book from the end of the Enlightenment, against which one might weigh the revolutionary activities of the brothers. While the adventures of Gregory and Charles during the revolution ended in a surprising and upsetting way, as we shall see, I am also fascinated by the 120 playing cards the brothers left behind. To begin, I would like to briefly narrate the chaotic story of the brothers' military engagements during the revolution. Gregory and Charles Dulac were born into a noble family in the Auvergne region in the south of France. They were the 3rd and 4th of 4 sons born to their parents, who owned estates near the town of Brioude, which you see on the map here, and outside the smaller town of Courpierre to the north. Gregory was born in 1762 and Charles in 1770. They were 30 and 22 years old in 1792 when the First French Republic emerged from the revolutionary crucible. Both men received military training as adolescents in preparation for careers in the Royal Army. The coming of the revolution appears to have split the Dulac family. By 1792 at the latest, their father and their 2 older brothers had left France, joining the ranks of the clergy and the nobility who fled when the revolution began. The 2 younger brothers, however, became revolutionary converts, choosing not to join their family in exile. In 1791, in the wake of Louis XVI's failed effort to flee France and make common cause with the anti-revolutionary forces beyond the borders, Gregory gave a passionate speech to a popular political society in Clermont-Ferrand denouncing the king. The speech was soon published by a local printer, and Gregory's break with his noble origins became evident to his contemporaries in the region. By the end of 1791, both Gregory and Charles were serving as sergeants in the Revolutionary Volunteer Battalion in their department, the Puy-de-Dôme. In 1792, the French declaration of hostilities against the monarchies of Europe and the United Kingdom also opened a rift between the politicians in Paris and the generals in the field. Officers like the Dulac brothers had to choose which generals to follow. In the summer of 1792, as the American Revolutionary War hero Lafayette continued to align himself with Louis XVI, Gregory chose incorrectly. This document, dated 10 August 1792, and signed by Lafayette, confirms the general's desire to maintain Dulac in the role of sub-lieutenant in an infantry regiment. But that very same day, an armed crowd invaded the Tuileries Palace in Paris, threatening the king and effectively ending the constitutional monarchy. 9 days later, Lafayette, who remained loyal to the monarch, was labeled a traitor to the nation The older Dulac, now associated with the disgraced general, was suspended from his military duties and imprisoned in Paris for several weeks. His detention, in turn, held up a new military appointment for Charles, his younger brother, until the end of September. The period of Gregory's imprisonment and Charles' suspended appointment coincided with a particularly intense phase of the revolution's military struggle against the crowned heads of Europe. The new hero who emerged in this moment was the Belgian general, Charles-François Dumouriez, who led the French troops to victory at Valmy in September 1792, staving off a foreign invasion that had threatened Paris. By the end of 1792, both brothers had found posts in the Army of the North, led by Dumouriez and Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan military officer who would become one of the liberators of Latin America. Several months later, however, in March of 1793, things were going terribly wrong on the Belgian front. The French troops were in flight, and Dumouriez and Miranda were each denouncing the other to the politicians back in Paris. On 3 April 1793, Charles Dulac, who had been serving in the Austrian Netherlands under Miranda as an aide de camp, rushed back to Paris to address the National Convention. There, he breathlessly condemned Dumouriez as a traitor to the Republic for his actions on and off the battlefield. By the summer of 1793, the brothers were no longer in the same military unit. Gregory returned to the Auvergne and his former responsibilities as a sergeant in the volunteer battalion in the Puy-de-Dôme. In this capacity, he led his troops into combat in late summer and early fall 1793 at the bloody siege of Lyon. Charles, however, did not return to the brothers' homeland. Building on the political capital he acquired with the Jacobins by denouncing General Dumouriez in Paris, he secured a military appointment on the eastern frontier in the summer and fall of 1793. This was the post he occupied when he was arrested in Paris at the end of 1793. We will examine the brothers' responses to these ups and downs, drawing on the writings on the back of their playing cards in a bit. Now, however, I would like to turn to a survey of playing cards in 18th century France, and then to an analysis of the 120 playing cards seized in the brothers' Parisian residence, which you see here again. The most obvious use for playing cards in 18th century France, as today, was that of gaming and gambling. Decks of playing cards were manufactured throughout the kingdom and widely available at all levels of society. Here you see the Grand Dauphin, right? He's right here, the son of Louis XIV, at a card table in a room specifically designed for this purpose at Versailles in 1695. He and the other elite courtiers are playing lansquenet, a notorious card game at which players routinely cheated. The postures of the players and the intensity with which several of them hold our gaze evokes the rigid court etiquette that prevailed at Versailles in the second half of the Sun King's reign. Playing cards circulated well beyond aristocratic circles in the 18th century and even before then. In this scene, set in a rustic pub by the Flemish artist Teniers the Younger, the two rapt players in the foreground lose themselves in their card game, while the three figures immediately behind them drink ale, smoke pipes, and lean in to comment on the proceedings. As this image attests, card playing was a way of countering the boredom of everyday life through intense competition at the card table. When one added money to the calculation, moral questions also arose, as this mid-17th century image by the French artist Mathieu Lenain suggests. The figure on the left is so engrossed in the game that he does not notice the figure to his left, signaling the contents of his hand to his opponent. This composition belongs to a rich Baroque genre of card sharp images that includes works by Caravaggio, Georges Latour, and others. Art historians have argued that the intent of these artists was to celebrate the culture of gaming at all levels of society, or to mock easily duped members of the privileged nobility, or to deliver moral lessons about the hazards of gambling, or perhaps all of these at once. Gaming and gambling were not the only set of meanings conjured up by playing cards before the Revolution. Decks of cards, produced on large sheets of composite paper with specialized stenciling processes, were also part of the print and visual media of pre-revolutionary France. In this trompe-l'oeil broadsheet, whose designer and engraver are uncertain, we see a jumble of images affixed to a noteboard. They commemorate important political events of the year 1713. Peeking out from the unorganized pile of texts and images are portions of 5 playing cards, which immediately attract attention because of the blocks of red, yellow, blue, and black that vividly stand out against the otherwise monotone composition. I would suggest that the engraver placed them there to emphasize the random order of the year's events, shuffled as though they were a deck of cards. Viewers of this engraving might have juxtaposed the self-absorbed private play of gamblers, suggested by the colorful playing cards, with the significant diplomatic and military events represented in the engravings that threaten to cascade out of the image towards the viewer. This 1710 printed game board offers another way to think about the uses of playing cards. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, designers and educators created high-end decks of cards intended to instruct users on topics such as military theory and practice. This game of fortifications takes the form of a broadsheet. It is laid out as a spiral path, beginning with the ace of diamonds, which you see down here in the lower left-hand corner, spiraling around, and ending with the king of hearts in the center of the print, just before the game's endpoint, this fully fortified citadel. Players roll a die to advance along the game board. Each space contains information about military design and strategy for the player to study. But each space is also a playing card, as the 52nd and last card before reaching the fortification, which features a miniature version of the King of Hearts in the upper right-hand corner, indicates. Owners of this broadsheet might have kept it intact to play the board game, or they might have cut it into 52 cards to be studied separately and used for other gaming or training purposes. The broadsheet fixes the cards in sequence, similar to the way a bound book orders its pages, but the broadsheet also offers the option of cutting and shuffling them, emphasizing the many purposes to which playing cards might be put. The non-gaming meanings of playing cards are further in evidence in the genre paintings by Jean-Siméon Chardin from the 1730s that portray adolescent boys building architectural structures with playing cards left behind by adults. Here you see 2 of the 4 extant Chardin paintings on this theme. The art historian Michael Fried has argued that Chardin's human figures, including those here, represent a level of self-absorption that is indifferent to the gaze of the viewer. Others have seen the presence of playing cards and coins on the tables as a moralizing caution against the temptations the youths will face once they reach adulthood. But one might also consider the materiality of Chardin's playing cards. Each youth seems to have stumbled upon the cards, left on a gaming table after adult card players had exited the scene. The boys are indifferent to the abstract games which the grown-ups have been playing. They repurpose these pieces of paper, some of which they fold along a vertical axis, to build a rudimentary house or a V-shaped wall-like structure, both of which are in danger of collapse. The white planes that make up the majority of the card house being built on the left in particular stand out. If not for the gaming table and the 2 upright bent cards that feature spades and clubs, it might not even be possible to recognize the bits of paper as playing cards. The Chardin images suggest a reality of everyday life in old regime France that has since been obscured. The scarcity of paper and the fact that decks became worn and could no longer be used for gambling meant that playing cards had a second life after the gaming table. Their blank backs could be used for purposes that had nothing to do with games of chance. We know from excise tax procedures and other archival sources that elite households and gambling parlors bought new decks by the dozens every season to replace those that were no longer serviceable. The discarded decks, rather than being tossed out, were sometimes given to servants or sold to those who could not afford new decks. In some instances, cards were sold by the pound or given to individuals who wanted to use the blank backs for a wide variety of purposes. In various archives in France and North America over the last several years, I have found used cards from the 18th century that served as receipts, as you see here, as business cards, as lists of household expenditures, and as a recipe for a laxative. Anytime individuals needed to make lists, keep track of financial obligations, or advertise their services, these small rectangular pieces of paper were convenient and plentiful. Furthermore, Playing cards could record information or be used for instructional purposes, as we have already seen with the fortifications game. Worn or discarded playing cards turned up in card catalogs in private libraries. A card catalog of 40 to 50,000 18th century playing cards is still held at the Mazarin Library in Paris. And Edward Gibbon also left behind over 1,600 playing cards, currently at the British Library in London, that itemized his personal book holdings. And in this card you see here, the Mémoires secrets of Bachaumont, the crucial source for 18th century historians, is listed. Used cards might also serve as flashcards for language learning, or as models for handwriting lessons. Cards were also repurposed as identifying labels for bound legal documents. This usage as a filing system for court cases appears to be the second most prevalent in the 1700s, after library card catalogs. The information theorist Marcus Krajewski has argued that these cataloging and filing efforts on the backs of playing cards are the predecessors of today's online databases, giving 18th century people access to what we might today call enhanced data storage and retrieval systems. It was not only amateur note takers and professional catalogers whose speculations appear on the backs of blank cards. Late in his life, Jean-Jacques Rousseau kept a handful of used playing cards in his pocket, allegedly so that he could jot down ideas that occurred during his solitary nature walks. The University Library in Neuchâtel holds 27 of these cards today. And here you see Jean-Jacques' musings about the existence of a deity scribbled on the back of a queen of clubs. These 27 cards with Rousseau's annotations are dwarfed, however, by an archive of over 35,000 playing cards left behind by the 18th century Genevan physicist, Georges-Louis Lesage. Their content has been studied exhaustively by Jean-François Baird, a historian of science, who has concluded that Lesage became increasingly obsessed with recording, organizing, and sorting the tiniest details of his inquiries into the natural world, to the extent that he was not able to proceed from the details of generalizations, from the details to generalizations that would allow him to publish his work. Lesage's obsessions with note-taking and procedure extended to his own mental processes as well, which he recorded in infinite detail on the backs of his used playing cards. Here you see a packet labeled "Plans for myself only" of my literary and psychological notes on myself, undated. This 3 of spades from that packet contains a series of complaints on both sides of the card about, quote, "the weakness of my attention span," end quote, and a set of strategies to record his observations on the playing cards so that he could keep track of them, sort them into a logical hierarchical order, and perhaps someday organize them into a narrative explanation of his own psychology. In this example of the uses of playing cards, therefore, we find poor Lesage lost in a confusing mental maze worthy of a Borges short story, unable to find an exit or to remember where he entered. It is left to the historian Baird to contextualize both the medium of his note-taking and the pathology of his intellectual activity. With the precedents of the Rousseau and Lesage playing card annotations in mind, let us now turn to the 120 playing cards found in the Paris residence of the Dulac brothers in 1793. The manufacturer of these cards was Jean Ducamus, whose name we see on several of the face cards preserved in the archives, including the left margin of this King of Spades. You see the name right here. Ducamus was a card maker in Clermont-Ferrand in the late 18th century, from whom someone in the Dulac family most likely purchased the cards. Although the archive contains 120 cards, it is missing an ace of clubs, a queen of clubs, a 6 of diamonds, and a 3 of spades. In contrast, there are 6 examples of the 8 of clubs and 5 each of the 10 of diamonds and the 7 of spades. This random distribution, when coupled with the local origins of the cards, suggests that one of the brothers had grabbed a fistful of them from the family stash of worn-out cards. Whether this happened before or after 1789 is unclear. The design of the face cards, such as this King of Spades, conforms to the pattern that was mandated by the Crown in the Auvergne before 1789. cards produced after the revolution initially did away with signs of royalty, such as crowns and scepters, which you see here. And in 1793, kings, queens, and jacks were replaced with motifs that were politically correct in the post-monarchical period. So on this card, you see a modified Parisian king of spades from the early revolution, in which the fleur-de-lis on the crown and on the scepter have been removed. They've been cut off of the woodblock. And on this card, you see a 1793 alternative to the old regime style of face cards, designed by the Parisian illustrator Jean Demosthène du Gourc, in which the biblical King David becomes the genius of the arts. While we can date the manufacture of the Dulac brothers cards to the pre-revolutionary period, it is harder to determine whether the annotations on the back of the cards were made before or during the revolution. The vast majority of the quotes are from sources published before 1789, but it is certainly possible that Gregory scribbled at least some of them on the back of the cards after the revolution broke out. Not all 120 cards feature pithy quotes on the back. A dozen of them have bibliographical citations, like that to Bachaumont we saw earlier, while 8 more, like this Jack of Hearts on the right, whose annotation defines the word iconoclast, sport dictionary definitions. Among the 95 cards that feature quotes on the back, the most popular sources are 18th century authors, followed by the pagan authors of antiquity and sayings from the Book of Proverbs and the Book of Wisdom in the Bible. I have been unable to determine sources for 23 of the quotes. The total number in the categories column on this slide exceeds 95 because a number of the cards have more than one quote on the back. Among these cards with quotes whose origins I have identified, the most frequently cited individual source was the biblical book of Proverbs, followed by the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca. Somewhat surprisingly, the 18th century political theorist of republicanism, Gabriel Bonnet de Mably, appears more frequently on the back of the Dulac cards than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This analysis suggests a mental horizon for the brothers that extended beyond the secular Republican sentiments of the post-1789 period, and even beyond the canonical works of the Enlightenment, to works of ancient Stoicism and 16th century skepticism and Christian morality. We might think of these 95 cards more usefully as an informal, unbound version of an 18th century commonplace book. Commonplacing dates at least as far back as the Renaissance, when humanists such as Erasmus compiled samples of effective rhetoric taken primarily from the Greeks and the Latins. At the end of the 17th century, John Locke published a work, initially in French in 1686, and then translated into English and published posthumously in 1706, which offered a new, more structured method for recording and organizing snippets copied from one's reading. The Lockean method found a devoted following on both sides of the channel throughout the 18th century. The anonymous 1765 Encyclopédie article, Recueil, or collection, offered a summary of Locke's commonplacing technique. Now, the Dulac cards do not constitute a strictly Lockean commonplace exercise. They are not bound up as a codex book, and they do not appear to have an organizing structure, as Locke had insisted they should. In a 2000 article, Robert Darnton suggested that the continuing popularity of commonplacing throughout the Enlightenment indicated what he called a segmented method of reading, in which readers jumped from book to book, rather than reading one volume after another sequentially. An easily retrievable collection of quotes might suit the practical needs of 18th century individuals better than a handsomely bound set of collected works in folio. The evidence from our 120 playing cards suggests that this may have been Gregory's preferred method of reading, and perhaps that of his brother Charles as well. We should take the playing cards seized from the Dulacs in December 1793 as a distilled, portable library into which one, if not both brothers, could dip as needed, shuffling the cards in a search for advice or consolation. When and how did Gregory and perhaps Charles consult these 120 playing cards? Unfortunately, nothing in the papers seized along with the playing cards provides any direct evidence about their use. Did the cards travel to the battlefield with the brothers? Did they consult them by candlelight as they struggled with the political and personal choices they faced in the midst of a revolution that tore apart the nation and their family? We don't know. But the other documents seized in December 1793 and bits and pieces of their life stories in these years found in other archives allow us to speculate on how the sentiments captured on the playing cards might have offered the brothers guidance and solace. At one level, the devotion by both brothers to the increasingly radical revolutionary propositions of the early republic appeared unshakable. In a written account of his conduct submitted to revolutionary administrators, Charles asserted that both he and his brother had served their fellow citizens in the republic with steadfast devotion to the cause. He concluded his self-assessment with the following statement, quote, "I do not participate in intrigues or indulge my ambitions. I wish only for the happiness of men who are free and equal. I have an inner confidence proven by my conduct that I will never be mistaken for or included among those hated for their traitorous acts," end quote. The tone of this account is one of unwavering certainty in the future of revolutionary France, in spite of the foreign and domestic perils faced by the revolution in the summer of 1793. It is echoed in several places on the backs of the playing cards, most notably in a one-sentence epithet found on the next to last playing card in the box. "Despotism begins where liberty ends." It is a slogan that one can easily imagine being proclaimed in the assemblies of popular political societies in Clermont-Ferrand and other French towns and villages in 1793, and a paraphrase of many revolutionary orators who trumpeted the contrast between the old regime and the new. But were the brothers always this firm in their revolutionary convictions? The same person who addressed the supremely self-confident self-appraisal to the revolutionary authorities in the Auvergne was also capable of existential despair. Charles wrote elsewhere to his brother of his inner agony, quote, "I sense only too bitterly my flaws, the crimes of which I am guilty. I see clearly how they debase me in this moment," end quote. In another letter written to Gregory in May of 1792, Charles welcomes, quote, "the true, the soul-shredding remorse that provides a proper baptism," end quote. And he makes a distinction between his head and his heart. He writes, "My head, my puny head led me astray. The heart alone is enough all by itself. The ability to distinguish between good and evil perhaps belongs to judgment, and in that sense to the mind and to the head, but to the heart. To the heart alone, sentiment is given and attributed. From this sublime gift springs everything that teaches us to hate evil and to love that which is good," end quote. His conclusion is that one should not rely on intellect. Instead, Charles coaches himself, he needs to privilege the passions and trust his heart. This approach may well have come from both biblical and secular sources that one finds on the back of the playing cards. An ace of diamonds in the brothers' possession quotes the Book of Wisdom on the virtues of the heart. "Love justice, you who are the terrestrial judges. Take from God sentiments worthy of him and seek them with a simple heart." A five of diamonds, meanwhile, cites Rousseau's Émile, who preaches that, quote, "a simple being who can live without passions and without attachments is hardly a man. Such a creature is either a brute or a god," end quote. Charles' moral universe extends beyond a sense of the civic duty one owes to one's fellow Republican citizens. His meditations are not limited to the secular political philosophy of 1789, nor to the de-Christianization movement of 1793. Elsewhere, he writes that he seeks a moral baptism. Charles confesses to his brother that he wants a spiritual purity derived from Christian teachings and describes a form of penance based on cleansing his heart rather than rigorously applying the rule of reason. These confessions on the part of Charles were encouraged by Gregory, his elder by 8 years. A striking impression that emerges from their correspondence is a joint effort to recast their relationship as one of father and son in the absence of their biological father, who had fled France. In their exchanges, Gregory sought to fill the role of paternal advisor vacated by their émigré father. He often refers to his younger sibling as mon cher fils, my dear son, and Charles frequently calls him mon bon père, my good father, or even mon père moral, my moral father. In 16 letters written in 1792 and 93, Gregory offers Charles advice on many matters. In late May of 1793, in the wake of the Dumouriez-Miranda affair, for example, he chides his younger brother's actions, which he considered impetuous. He writes, quote, "I have recognized great qualities in you, but they have not hidden your flaws. You give me sufficient proof that your selfishness exists not only when you yield to your anger, but even in more sensible moments," end quote. 2 months later, he advises Charles to decline his role as the people's representative to the armies in the North as too dangerous politically. He counsels Charles instead to follow in his own footsteps and return to the volunteer army in the Auvergne as a foot soldier, quote, "where you will be sheltered from suspicion and from slanderers, and you will have no other passion than the love of the fatherland that will propel you towards a Republican career." In short, in the second half of 1793, his older brother pleaded with Charles to abandon the perils of military service at the national level, return to their home, and join the local militia. So repeatedly in these letters, we find Gregory advising Charles on how to make his way in the world. This advice is also present on the back of their used playing cards. Gregory's exhortation to care for his reputation and friendships finds an echo in a quote from the Book of Wisdom on a king of clubs. "A good reputation is preferable to great wealth, and friendship to gold and silver." Seneca, for his part, had advice on the regulation of emotions that Gregory noted on a 10 of clubs. Quote, "He who masters his passions finds the calm that all the world seeks." While the brothers framed the denunciation of their father in the anti-paternalist politics of the moment, Gregory also reached back to biblical morality and the stoicism of the ancients in an effort to guide his brother through the treacherous maelstrom of the revolution. Gregory was particularly forthcoming with advice about Charles' romantic life. He reminded Charles that as his older brother, he had more experience with women, and he tried to quell his brother's self-doubts by focusing on Charles' relationship with Annette Allende, their 20-year-old noble neighbor who lived back home. In October of 1793, Gregory writes to Charles saying, "Oh, my friend, oh, my son, your friend Annette will assure your happiness. Live for her." 7 letters from Annette to Charles have survived in the National Archives. Unfortunately, none of Charles' letters to her remain. Nevertheless, Annette's writings and Charles' laments to Gregory make it clear that Annette and Charles felt passionately about each other. To take one example, revolutionary correspondence in 1793 often featured the phrase, "Year 4 of the Republic, one and indivisible," at the top of the first page. In the heading to her letter to Charles here, dated 14 August 1793, Annette playfully parrots this revolutionary motto, reminding Charles that it is, quote, "l'encatre de notre amour," year 4 of our love. Nevertheless, their relationship while Charles was away at war was not an easy one. Annette's noble family was not pleased about her attachment to one of the revolutionary Dulac brothers. Like Charles, 2 of her brothers had already gone into exile by 1792. Later, in summer 1793, with the rise of Jacobinism in the Auvergne, Annette warned Charles that her family might soon be imprisoned for its residual royalist sympathies, in which case their correspondence would be cut off. Annette's feelings for Charles shine through the letters. She signs off one letter in December 1792, for example, by writing, "I love you more than I can say, and I am yours for life." Nevertheless, she makes it clear that as a member of the nobility and a woman, she does not share all of Charles' views. In October 1792, she proclaims to him, quote, "I am not political. I follow the voice of my heart, and I fear that no matter what you might say to control my conduct, it would be impossible for me to love someone who oppresses the weak and the innocent," end quote. In her last letter to Charles from September of 1793, she upbraids him, writing, "I have made it a habit to expect nothing more of fortune than the most cruel blows. I am philosophical enough to understand that a man animated by the desire for glory can easily neglect a woman and only think of her in his moments of leisure. This is what is called l'amour à la républicaine, Republican-style love, and therefore also known as l'amour à la Dulac, Dulac-style love. She then turns to his most recent letter, in which Charles had apparently shared an epigram worthy of being inscribed on the back of a playing card. He had written, quote, "A woman's heart is more loving but less firm than a man's. Absence weighs heavily upon her." Annette categorically rejects this assertion, telling him that if he believes this, he does not know her well. It was not his absence that left her distraught, but the fear that his feelings for her did not reciprocate those she had for him. Throughout these 2 tumultuous years, she was tormented by the thought that what she characterized as his Republican-style love would be inadequate. In the romantic realm, as well as the revolutionary one, therefore, the brothers' dedication to the new regime placed them in conflict with their past lives and their current pursuits. On card 95, which, as it turns out, is an ace of hearts, Gregory had captured the following quote from Mably's Entretien de Phocion, which is subtitled On the Relation of the Moral to the Political. It was published in 1763. Mably writes, "Impose silence on your passions in order to consult your reason, and it will teach you all the duties of man." But it proved difficult for both Charles Dulac and Annette Allende in 1792 and 1793 to quiet their hearts. As we reach the end of this talk, you may be wondering what happened to Charles after he was arrested in December of 1793. I have some good news. He managed to keep his head on his shoulders. The prison records indicate that he was freed on 14 Germinal year 2 or 3 April 1794. After his release, it appears that he finally followed Gregory's advice and returned to the Auvergne to enmesh himself in local affairs. I have not yet been able to determine if he found Annette waiting for him on his return. What I have learned about the 2 brothers in the summer and fall of 1794, however, is surprising, given what I have told you so far about their experiences in the 2 previous years. Soon after Charles returned to the Auvergne in the late spring of 1794, both Gregory and Charles began to court a noblewoman living in Clermont-Ferrand named Marie-Sylvie Saulnier, who had recently divorced her first husband, a local notary, on grounds of incompatibility. 3 times over the summer, Gregory proposed to her. After she rejected him the last time, Gregory committed suicide by poisoning himself in her apartment early on the morning of 15 August 1794. And a little over a month later, Charles married this same woman in Clermont-Ferrand in front of a town official and 5 witnesses. While the archives confirm that these events transpired, I have not found documents that would allow one to make sense of this unanticipated turn of events. Even if I eventually discover more archival traces, I doubt that they will provide a convincing explanation for this unexpected denouement. The journey that led Gregory from the role of revolutionary firebrand and surrogate father to suicidal suitor of a recent divorcee may simply not be recoverable more than 220 years later. It may not have been understandable at the time. Nor is it easy to imagine the range of emotions that Charles must have felt as he buried his brother and married the woman who had spurned Gregory. Had the brothers' Republican and fraternal solidarity foundered on their rivalry for the hand of Madame Saulnier? Had young Charles regretfully married her because of the assets she had obtained during her divorce earlier in the year? What happened to his love for Annette? Sometimes the archives do not have answers for us. What I can offer, however, is a final quote from the back of one of the Dulac playing cards. Before doing so, I call your attention to this allegorical painting by Jean-Baptiste Regnault, made in 1794 and exhibited at the Salon the following year. In it, the winged genius of France poses a stark choice to the viewer. One can either opt for the light of liberty, reason, and republicanism on the left, or the skeletal darkness of death and nothingness on the right. The case of the Dulac brothers, however, argues that this binary is false. Both of the brothers repeatedly chose the promise of liberty and republicanism in the cataclysmic years from 1789 to 1794. Yet Gregory still met a meaningless end soon after the fall of Robespierre and the demise of the Terror, leaving Charles to pick up the shattered pieces of their dreams, now entrenched in a marriage he could have scarcely imagined a year before. At some earlier point, Gregory had been struck by a quote from Cicero, via Montaigne, and recorded it on the back of an 8 of clubs. The whole life of the philosopher is a meditation upon death. The experiences of the brothers during the revolution played out in a confusing sequence of factionalism and personal peril in ways that defy a coherent political or moral interpretation. Perhaps one or both of them intuitively understood how difficult it would be to make sense of their revolutionary experiences, which is why they held on to the playing cards that have sat silently in the French National Archives for over 2 centuries. The blank backs of the cards allowed them and permit us to connect with those who have philosophized before us. They offer ways, perhaps elusive, to make sense of the fate that awaits us all.
Thank you. So we have several minutes for questions and comments. At this time, I would like to invite participants to add a question or a comment into the chat, which I can read aloud for Jeff. While you're thinking of your questions and writings, I would like to read the territorial acknowledgement for this session and for the conference, which I should have done at the very beginning. The land on which the business office of the American Society for 18th Century Studies operates is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home of the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to manage our learned society in this territory. So, Jeff, I don't see a question. I'm sure people are writing them. I may take this opportunity to ask you something about this research. One of the things I noticed about your presentation is that you, in showing us the examples of the cards with the bits of information from their second life, remind us of their identity as playing cards in their first life. So the quotes that you'll read, you'll remind us that this is an 8 of diamonds, etc. So it occurs to me that this is a really sort of rich and interesting potential for cross-referencing these two types of meaning. In their status as playing cards, these bits of paper have all sorts of meanings and bits of order attached to them, right? They're there as entities in one of many different games, these sort of rule-bounded systems. The suits, the ranks of the cards imply a hierarchy. In some cases, the identities of the cards have been modified according to what one imagines are sort of political motivations or sort of cultural norms that are shifting. In their second life, we imagine they are sort of reduced to blank bits of paper, and their important qualities in that life involve their portability, durability. They are writing surfaces, they're cheap, available, they can be ordered and reordered in whatever way, and they lend themselves to, memes, to sort of little bites of information of any sort of sort of type. So it's very suggestive, and I'm curious to know your sort of experience researching these and presenting them. Why was it important to remind us of the identity of an individual card in its first life alongside its identity in the second life? Do you imagine that the users of these cards grab a bunch of them and just ignore their identity as playing cards? Do you find any evidence that as someone is writing down a quote or a recipe or a spare thought, that somehow the identity of the card as a playing tool intrudes on what they're writing? Is there any sort of productive cross-reference going on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the reason why I felt the need to remind people of what was on the front of the card as well as on the back of the card is simply so that as I was going through this material, we would all keep in mind those two meanings, the gaming side of the front card and the many uses to which people put the back sides of the cards. I have not found any evidence in places that I have been looking so far that when people went down to, like when one of the Dulac brothers went to write down a quote from Cicero that struck them, they looked at the front of the cards to pick out a meaningful card. But I think there are ways, there are places that I plan to look, and there are ways that there may be those kinds of connections. In the Beinecke Library at Yale, for example, there's a deck of old regime playing cards that has little engravings of mythological figures pasted on the back of them. And I'm sure there was some sort of game that was played between both sides, and I want to study that more and figure it out. During the Revolution, there's a deck of cards, I think it's in the second half of the 1790s during the Directory, in which little bon mots and sort of suggestive little phrases are printed on the front sides of the cards. And so that would suggest a parallel between gambling and courtship of one way or another. So I think those things are there, but they were definitely not there with the Dulac cards. They seem to have just grabbed them randomly and written things on them.
All right. Question from Dina Goodman. Jeff, wonderful talk. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the joint use of the cards by the two brothers. Common placing is tightly associated with the development of the self. What does this joint set of cards suggest about the 18th century self? And can you tell us who wrote which notes?
Thanks, Dina. I think that all of the notes on the back of the cards were written by Gregory. I base that on having read a number of letters by both brothers and the other documents that survive. The handwriting looks pretty clearly to me to be that of Gregory and not of Charles. The larger question of what does this tell us about the 18th century self is what I was trying to grapple with in the paper, and I'm going to keep on working on this for an article version. The difficulty of the problem that you point out is knowing how it's the reception problem that all of us who work on book history have. It's knowing how these things were read, how they were reconfigured, how they were applied in the moments of everyday life. And so what I tried to do in the talk was to evoke some of the incredibly perilous and treacherous political and personal situations the brothers tried to navigate and see what one might get from reading the playing cards and applying that there. Another thing I didn't talk about is the brothers' determination to try to salvage the family's property, even though the father and the two older brothers had left France. And they go to great lengths, both before the revolutionary authorities in Auvergne and also before the National Convention in Paris to try to reclaim their family's property. So this again to me is a tension between being avid Republicans, but also being committed to notions of property and family that are clearly old regime oriented. So I'll stop there.
So we just have a minute left. Because two different participants have basically asked the same question, Natalia Baldiga and Peggy Elliott, I will ask, what brought you to discover these cards and to embark on studying them systematically?
Okay, very quickly, I'll just say I'm writing a book on the history and uses of playing cards in France from the mid-17th to the mid-19th century. I've been collecting this material for a long time. This particular set of cards and the documents I found because archives are more and more digitized, and I was able to just search on the word carte à jouer or jeu de cartes and found this treasure trove in the National Archives of Pierrefitte. So.
Wonderful. There are excellent other questions. We'll try to find a way to save these. This session may end very quickly, so I'll just say thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for so many contributions to the society, especially in the last year. And if there's nothing else, I hope everyone will enjoy the rest of the conference.
And thanks to Ernest and to Barbara, our interpreters, too, for signing for this talk.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I'm going to copy these questions in the chat, though I imagine there's a way to access them later.
Yeah, that would be great. And people can email me too if they have questions. Okay, I think we're done.
Thank you.
Panel, thank you so much. Barbara,
Sure.
thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.